It's June 11, 2019. On the grand stage of the Square Enix E3 press conference, an iconic menu appears on screen, soliciting cheers from the fans in attendance. The interface is immediately recognizable. Simple fonts, a gloved finger pointing at the words, new game, and crisp sound effects that transport those watching over 20 years into the past. Only this time, there's a profound addition. The word remake appears to the sound of delighted screams from the audience. Then the theme swells. The camera pans in front of a girl who slowly opens her eyes. Suddenly, we cut to a train speeding through a steel and concrete jungle carrying a blonde soldier with a massive sword. This is what fans have been waiting for. The first in-depth introduction of Final Fantasy VII Remake begins. Despite all that anticipation, Final Fantasy VII Remake risks getting lost in the crowd of massive game reveals at E3 2019. Just look at the competition it faced: Borderlands 3, Cyberpunk 2077, Super Smash Bros. Ultimate, Elden Ring, and even The Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom. A competition of the most hype generated among these anticipated games would be a battle of Olympic proportions. Even among such prestigious peers though, Final Fantasy VII Remake was special. Rather than a sequel to a beloved franchise or some fresh new idea, Square Enix was cooking up a modern take on a classic game. Not just any classic either. Final Fantasy VII was a formative experience for a whole generation of gamers. The remake reveal garnered screams, praise, and tears of joy from the audience. It was about more than just the high-quality visuals and beautiful character design. The key to all of this emotion was unbridled nostalgia, the feeling of reuniting with a beloved friend after so many years apart. What touched players was a classic that shook the gaming world more than 2 decades ago. A game that had left unforgettable memories in their hearts, and now it appeared before them with a whole new look. A fresh take on an undeniable classic from a bygone era. Let's turn back the clock and take a look at why Final Fantasy VII is still remembered and deeply adored by players all of these years later.
TapTap.
Great success is always the result of the right timing, the right conditions, and the right people, and the Final Fantasy series is no exception. In 1987, a young college dropout named Hironobu Sakaguchi convinced a struggling game company to create a game similar to the best-selling Dragon Quest. For Sakaguchi, this idea was his last-ditch effort. If it didn't work, he'd be forced to quit his part-time job at Square and return to college. And for Square itself, it was the latest and potentially final attempt to succeed in creating a breakthrough hit game after a string of failures. Fortunately, the dawning era of Japanese RPGs provided them with an opportunity, and the success of Nintendo's Famicom gave them the advantage. But the most important foundation of Final Fantasy's success was the human touch. Specifically, the touch of some incredibly talented game developers. This groundbreaking game included character design by Yoshitaka Amano, a script by Sakaguchi, and music by Nobuo Uematsu. The emergence of Final Fantasy had special significance for the Japanese gaming industry at the time. It not only challenged the dominance of Dragon Quest in the RPG field, but also paved the way for a wave of successors that continues to this day, including games and franchises like Romancing Saga, Shin Megami Tensei, Grandai, Valkyrie Profile, and Fire Emblem, just to name a few. Final Fantasy brought fame to Sakaguchi and Square. It became the developer's crown jewel, and the 5 sequels that followed over the next decade each rose to greater heights of success. From Final Fantasy II onward, it was plain to see how each new game in the series was making progress. The 2D pixel artwork evolved, the narratives grew more complex and engaging, and the talented musicians, artists, and other developers allowed Final Fantasy to keep surpassing itself. By the time Final Fantasy VI was released, Square could portray powerful mechs lumbering across vast snowy plains and towering mechanical castles navigating through desert wastes. In one of its most memorable moments, a moving and heartbreaking opera scene is conveyed using what we think of now as simple pixelated characters and limited animation. This breakthrough in storytelling overcame the technical limitations of the Super Nintendo hardware and amazed players in 1994. Final Fantasy VI surpassed many contemporary games of its time and marked the latest in a series of escalating successes for Square across 2 generations of video game consoles. Despite these accolades though, Final Fantasy still faced an inevitable problem: a bottleneck stalling the growth of the series. A bottleneck can come in many shapes and sizes. When a franchise like Final Fantasy develops and expands through multiple iterations, it will inevitably encounter its own bottleneck. This could be caused by creative exhaustion. Think about the Fast and Furious movies. Changes in market demands. Command & Conquer says nice, or personal turnover. But for Final Fantasy, an IP that was no longer lacking in money, staff, corporate support, or creative ideas, the only real bottleneck was the constant desire among a group of industry lumineers to one-up their last effort over and over again. That passion drove Square to take an unprecedented leap forward with Final Fantasy VII. Just how successful is Final Fantasy VII? We only need to take a look at its predecessor, Final Fantasy VI, which set a new sales record for the series by selling more than 3 million copies worldwide. Final Fantasy VII surpassed that number by over 3 times, selling over 10 million copies on PlayStation 1 and another million when it was ported to PC a year later. However, numbers alone can't tell the whole story of Final Fantasy VII's impact. Just ask a few non-gamer friends if they've heard of the names like Sephiroth, Tifa, and Ares, or Aerith for those who played the Japanese version. See if any random gamer can identify Cloud's distinctive spiky hairdo. Final Fantasy VII has had an impact on gaming culture and beyond to the degree that its characters, world, music, and themes have become iconic. And as with the first Final Fantasy, the success of Final Fantasy VII was the result of a synthesis of right timing, the right conditions, and the right people. Following the release of Final Fantasy VI, the core team behind the franchise envisioned a transformation. Sakaguchi was now the vice president of Square, and alongside other key figures, he had a bold idea to turn Final Fantasy into a 3D game. In the years between the start of Final Fantasy VII's concept phase in 1994 and its release in 1997, several hit 3D games had already emerged, including Quake, Tomb Raider, Descent, and Super Mario 64. Even all the way back in 1994, Virtua Fighter on the Sega Saturn was paving the way for 3D gaming on home consoles. Though they were advanced for their time, early 3D games often required reused assets, simplified graphics, and other compromises to reduce technical strain. Even groundbreaking 3D titles like Super Mario 64, which overcame challenges in storage, camera angles, and controls, adopted a more achievable cartoonish art style for character models. Those kinds of shortcuts wouldn't work for an immersive RPG that required a fully realized 3D world. Sakaguchi himself said, "Back then, it was a big step for 2D to 3D. And it was difficult even in my head to picture what the battle scenes should look like." To add to that challenge, none of Square's developers had previous experience in 3D production. And on top of that, Final Fantasy VII was staring down the limitations of Nintendo's upcoming successor to the SNES, the Nintendo 64. The N64's capabilities were certainly impressive enough for the time, with a 64-bit CPU, higher video memory, and more RAM than other consoles on the market. This allowed games like The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time and Super Mario 64 to showcase top-notch performance in the 3D realm. However, its excellence couldn't make up for one massive drawback: cartridges. While an 8MB cartridge was enough to run the entirety of Super Mario 64, it couldn't hold the expansive world that Square wanted to build in Final Fantasy VII. The game's art director made numerous attempts to solve this issue with the help of other artists and programmers at Square, but they never managed to figure it out to the level that satisfied the team's high expectations. Around the same time that Square was struggling to figure out how Final Fantasy VII would fit onto a 64 cartridge, Sony's PlayStation emerged. This new player in the gaming space used compact discs that could store over 600 megabytes of data, ideal for hosting bigger games. Alongside more space for every aspect of this ambitious project, moving development to PlayStation would allow Square to use pre-rendered CG cutscenes to depict visuals that in-game 3D couldn't achieve. Thus, with a fateful decision by Square, Final Fantasy VII ended the series' historic franchise exclusivity with Nintendo and shifted to Sony's camp. Having secured the right timing with the skyrocketing popularity of the PlayStation 1, Sony also had provided the right conditions. According to Square's then president Tomoyuki Tagachi, Sony offered them a publishing deal with basically the best deal they were giving to any publisher. This included an extremely low royalty rate, which meant that Square would earn nearly as much money on sales as if it published the game itself. And then we come back to the right people. When it comes to developers, Square went all out for Final Fantasy VII. First, they expanded the team significantly. Final Fantasy VI had a development team in the realm of 40 to 60 people. The team for Final Fantasy VII expanded to about 150 members, and combined with support staff and outsourcing, the total number of people involved with Final Fantasy VII's creation exceeded 350 people. Compare that to Final Fantasy VII's most direct competitor for JRPG released in 1997, Grandia, that was developed by Game Arts in cooperation with 9 companies for the Sega Saturn, only tallied around 200 contributors, including voice actors. In addition to hiring many more developers, Square Enix purchased SGI workstations for most of its designers at the cost of $70,000 each. Costs for other equipment, including the PlayStation Development Kit, were also calculated in millions. Looking at this picture, you can see that one complete workstation for a Square Enix developer was quite costly. Final Fantasy VII's development costs reached over $45 million, and the spending approached $100 million when you include advertising costs. It was an incredible investment, but it allowed talented developers to use state-of-the-art equipment on their quest to create an extraordinary game. On January 31st, 1997, Final Fantasy made its grand debut in Japan. With the support of 3D and CG technology, the game's opening sequence stunned countless players. The camera followed a young girl out of an alley, gradually zooming out to reveal a square, a clock, and finally reaching the top of the gigantic Shinra building. Then the camera zoomed down towards a speeding train. A blonde young man jumped from the train, and players suddenly realized they were now in control of Cloud Strife. This single-shot presentation and seamless transition into animated cutscenes, now commonplace in modern games, was a breakthrough at the time. Final Fantasy VII stood out from other RPGs at the time with its unmatched visual effects. Hironobu Sakaguchi's dream of narrative-driven gameplay was coming true, enhanced by the power of CG technology. Apart from the captivating cutscenes, the characters and storyline in Final Fantasy VII helped build fond memories of the game in the hearts of players. Due to the unique demands of 3D rendering, the responsibility for character design shifted from Yoshitaka Amano, who emphasized artistic and impactful visuals, to Tetsuya Nomura, whose style blended both elegance and ruggedness. The aloof yet kind-hearted Cloud, the innocent but resilient Aerith, the hard-knuckled Tifa, who became the first example of a waifu for many gamers, and the charismatic antagonist Sephiroth, a living embodiment of heroism, revenge, reason, and madness. These characters, masterfully crafted by Nomura and contemplated by ideas from Hironobu Sakaguchi and Yoshitaka Amano, possess charm and appeal, yes, but more importantly, they felt complex and authentic. If 3D graphics and memorable character designs were all Final Fantasy VII had going for it, it might not have had such a massive impact. After all, by the end of 1997, Quake 2's 3D modeling had already graphically surpassed the graphics of Final Fantasy VII. What set Final Fantasy VII apart was its ability to perfectly integrate those 3D visuals and cinematic storytelling in a lengthy plot full of rich details. For instance, although the game's many environments were created using pre-rendered CG textures, these locations were not a static flat image. Lighting effects, steam, fire, and rippling water surfaces enhanced the sense of place. Even camera angles could change in real time, further augmenting the game's cinematic immersion. Characters would also react to their surroundings in ways that had rarely, if ever, been seen before. For example, when players reached a snowy mountain area later in the game, Cloud rubs his hands together and shivers due to the inappropriately thin clothing for the environment. As for Final Fantasy VII's most crucial gameplay aspect, the combat system, it really speaks for itself. Let's just admire one of the game's stunning summon animations. The visual effects of Final Fantasy VII astounded players and showed off the lofty technical feats that the OG PlayStation could achieve. At the time, graphics and effects this powerful often required a PC with a Voodoo 3D accelerator card, which combined would cost several times more than a PlayStation 1. Square managed to fit a visual magnum opus that felt years ahead of its time on 3 CD-ROMs. Of course, these 3 CD-ROMs carry more than just lines of programming. Final Fantasy VII's size across all 3 discs totaled 1.3 gigabytes, and a significant portion of that was devoted to music composed by the legendary Nobuo Uematsu. As had become standard with the series by this point, Final Fantasy VII featured distinctive, memorable tunes like One Winged Angel and the Mako Reactor theme. More importantly, the vast capacity of CDs allowed Uematsu to break free from the limitations of chiptune music and finally unleash his creativity. Classical, rock, symphonic, large-scale choruses, complex orchestral arrangements, Uematsu handled them all with ease. Final Fantasy VII's music was diverse yet perfectly matched the game's themes, supporting Square's cinematic vision, and the tunes are good enough that they hold up to listening outside of the game. To this day, it remains one of the most popular video game soundtracks of all time, and has been performed live in concerts and received dozens upon dozens of covers, remixes, and arrangements from adoring fans. Final Fantasy VII may have some shortcomings from an objective distance. For instance, the 3D character models may not be as realistic and detailed as those in later games of its generation, such as The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time or Resident Evil 2. The quality of the CG also falls short compared to its visually stunning PlayStation 1 successors, Final Fantasy VIII and Final Fantasy IX. Whatever improvements we can imagine now though, the fact remains that at the crossroads of an industry-wide transition from 2D to 3D, Square seized the opportunity. Developers like Hironobu Sakaguchi, Tetsuya Nomura, and Yoshinori Kitase worked tirelessly to sculpt a masterpiece. Square's bold vision provided the right conditions. Its talented developers were the right people. And the new technology and shift in player expectations brought up the right timing. With those 3 elements aligned, it's no surprise that Final Fantasy VII became the most influential installment in the Final Fantasy series, and a cherished memory for an entire generation of experienced RPG enthusiasts and newcomers alike. Time never stops marching forward, and with it comes unavoidable change. In 2003, Square merged with its one-bitter rival, Enix, and the developers and players who shared cherished memories of Final Fantasy VII are 25 years older. Fortunately, Square Enix finally decided to reintroduce its masterpiece to a new generation with Final Fantasy VII Remake. When the first part of the Final Fantasy VII Remake saga launched in 2020, it touched our hearts with small yet significant improvements on the original's formula. With the technology of the present day, we can clearly see what the drink that Tifa makes for Cloud really looks like. We can feel the thrill of speeding down a Midgar highway on a futuristic motorcycle. We can explore these glorious 3D environments freely from any camera angle. We can marvel at the grandeur of Midgar and appreciate Cloud's intricate Buster Sword. We can even enjoy that eye-popping and infamous cross-dressing scene with a newfound sense of playfulness. If the years passed in game as they have in reality, the once youth Cloud would now be a seasoned veteran. And the Final Fantasy series itself has long since reached adulthood after 36 years of existence. Not every subsequent Final Fantasy game has been as creatively and financially successful as Final Fantasy VII. Not every game in the series has produced something as iconic and memorable as Cloud's Buster Sword, and not everyone has been as dedicated as a character like Barret to uphold the beliefs and ideals the franchise grew famous for. Nevertheless, Final Fantasy has weathered the passage of time and stands as a pillar in gaming. It may have started as a last-ditch effort at success, but it's now a paragon of the kind of storytelling and adventures that only gaming can provide.